Jake Martinez stared out the massive viewing window at the stars spinning slowly past. The Centauri Academy was huge, bigger than any building he had ever seen on Earth. It was like a small city floating in space, with shining metal corridors and glowing lights everywhere. Students from dozens of different planets walked through the halls, and Jake still felt amazed every time he saw them. He had been at the Academy for 3 months now, and he still felt like he did not belong. Earth had only recently joined the Galactic Federation, and humans were still new to everything. Most of the other species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. They had technologies that seemed like magic to Jake, and they made it clear that they thought humans were not very smart. Jake walked down the corridor toward his advanced problem-solving class. Other students moved past him without looking. There was a group of Kithara, who looked like giant insects with shiny black shells and clicking sounds when they talked. Their 4 arms moved quickly as they discussed mathematical equations that Jake could not understand. Behind them came 2 Vorthan who looked like walking crystals. They did not speak with words, but instead flashed different colored lights from their bodies. A massive Morgani floated past, using its 12 tentacles to carry books and tablets. The creature was twice as tall as Jake and looked like a cross between an octopus and a jellyfish. Its big eyes stared at Jake for a moment, and Jake thought he saw something like pity in them. The worst part was that Jake knew they were probably right to pity him. In his 3 months at the Academy, he had struggled with most of his classes. The math was too advanced, the science used concepts he had never heard of, and the technology was beyond anything Earth had. His grades were the lowest in almost every class. Jake reached the classroom and took his usual seat in the back corner. The room was designed to fit many different types of beings, with seats that could change shape and size. The ceiling was high enough for the tallest students, and the floor had special areas for those who did not use chairs. Dr. Keltash entered the room with his usual confident stride. The professor was a Sauridian, standing nearly 8 feet tall with green scales and yellow eyes. His long tail swished behind him as he moved, and his sharp teeth showed when he talked. He had made it very clear from the first day that he did not think much of humans. "Good morning, class," Dr. Keltash said, his voice deep and slightly hissing. "Today we will be working on a very special challenge. I hope you have all prepared your minds for serious thinking." Jake noticed how the professor's eyes seemed to skip over him when he said this. It was like Jake was not even worth looking at. The other students in the class were the best from their species. There was Zix, a Kithara who could solve math problems faster than most computers. The 2 Vorthon students, Bright Pattern and Quick Flash, could process information in ways that made Jake's head hurt just thinking about it. The Morgani student, whose name Jake could not pronounce, could think about 12 different problems at the same time using its distributed brain. "As you know," Dr. Keltash continued, "this academy is designed to challenge the greatest minds in the galaxy. We do not accept average students here. We only want those who can push the boundaries of knowledge and understanding." Jake felt his face get hot. Everyone knew that Earth had gotten a special deal to send students to the Academy. It was part of the treaty that brought humans into the Galactic Federation. Jake was not here because he was the smartest human, but because Earth needed representatives at the galaxy's best school. Today's challenge will test everything you have learned about logical thinking, pattern recognition, and problem solving, the professor said. It will separate those who truly belong here from those who... He paused and looked directly at Jake. Well, from those who do not. Jake's classmates turned to look at him. Some looked curious, others seemed amused. Jake had gotten used to being the entertainment in class. Whenever there was a difficult problem, Dr. Keltash would ask Jake to try first, just to show everyone how much smarter the other students were. Zix clicked his mandibles, and what Jake had learned was laughter among the Kefera. Perhaps the human can provide comic relief while we work on the real solution, he said. His voice sounded like metal scraping against metal. Bright pattern flashed a pattern of blue and green lights. Jake had been studying Vorthon communication, and he was pretty sure the lights meant something like amusing, inferior creature. Quick Flash responded with yellow and red flashes that probably meant agreement. The Morgani student just watched, with its big eyes. Jake had never figured out what the creature thought about anything. It never seemed mean like some of the others, but it never seemed friendly either. I understand that humans have certain limitations, Dr. Keltash said. Your species evolved on a single planet with no real challenges to your thinking. You never had to solve the complex problems that come with space travel or dealing with multiple species. You are adapted for simple tasks, like growing food and building basic shelters. Jake wanted to argue, but he knew it would just make things worse. Besides, when he looked at what his classmates could do, it was hard to disagree. They could solve problems in minutes that would take him hours or days. However, the professor continued, this exercise will be educational for everyone. It will show you the difference between truly advanced thinking and... He gestured toward Jake. Well, whatever it is that humans do. The classroom was quiet, except for the soft humming of the air systems and the distant sound of the Academy's engines. Jake could feel everyone watching him, waiting to see what he would do. He had learned not to try too hard in these situations. It was better to just accept that he would fail and try not to embarrass himself too much. Are you ready for today's challenge? Dr. Keltash asked the class. The alien students responded with clicks, flashes, and tentacle movements that all meant yes. Jake just nodded quietly. Excellent, the professor said with a smile that showed all of his sharp teeth. Let me introduce you to something that has puzzled the greatest minds in the galaxy for over 200 years. Dr. Keltash walked to a secured cabinet at the front of the classroom. He pressed his scaly hand against a scanner, and the cabinet opened with a soft hiss. Inside, sitting on a cushioned platform, was something that made everyone in the room lean forward with interest. The object was about the size of a basketball, but it was not round like a ball. Instead, it had many flat surfaces that met at strange angles. The whole thing seemed to be made of metal, but the metal changed colors as Jake watched. First it was silver, then blue, then a deep purple that seemed to glow from inside. This, Dr. Keltash said as he carefully lifted the object, is called the Nexus Cube. It was discovered in the ruins of the predecessor civilization on the dead planet of Xerion Prime. Jake had heard of the predecessors in his galactic history class. They were an ancient race that had disappeared long before any of the current civilizations had developed space travel. All that remained of them were ruins on dead planets and artifacts like this one. The professor placed the cube on a special stand in the center of the classroom. Now Jake could see it better, and it was even more amazing up close. The surface was covered with tiny symbols and patterns that seemed to move and shift. Some areas had what looked like buttons or touch panels, while others had grooves and raised sections that formed complex geometric shapes. The predecessors were the most advanced civilization we know of, Dr. Keltash continued. Their technology was so far beyond ours that we still cannot understand most of what they built. This cube is one of their puzzle devices designed to test intelligence and problem-solving ability. Zix clicked excitedly. Professor, is it true that the Cathara Collective spent 30 years trying to solve it? Indeed, the professor nodded. The finest mathematical minds of your species worked on this puzzle for 3 decades. They mapped every symbol, measured every angle, and calculated millions of possible combinations. They never found the solution. Bright pattern. And Quick Flash flashed rapid patterns of light at each other. Jake was getting better at reading Vorthan communication, and he thought they were discussing the mathematical complexity of the object. The Vorthan Crystal Council also attempted. To solve the puzzle, Dr. Keltash said. They assigned an entire generation of their best scholars to study it. For 67 years, they analyzed its energy patterns and tried to match its vibrations with their harmonic calculations. They also failed. The Morgani student extended several tentacles toward the cube, though it was careful not to touch it. Jake knew that Morgani could sense things through vibrations and electrical fields that other species could not detect. Even the great Morgani collective mind was unable to solve it, the professor said. They connected their greatest thinkers into a single consciousness and focused all their mental power on the puzzle for 20 years. Still, they found no answer. Jake stared at the cube. If the smartest beings from the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy could not solve it, what chance did anyone in this room have? And what chance did he have? The cube is believed to contain technological secrets from the predecessor civilization, Dr. Keltash explained. Scanning devices can detect complex mechanisms inside, but they cannot determine what those mechanisms do. Some scientists think it might contain plans for faster-than-light communication. Others believe it holds the secret to unlimited energy production. What makes you think it can be solved at all? Asked the Morgani student in its strange, echoing voice. Because it responds to touch, the professor said. When someone handles the cube, the patterns change and the colors shift. It is clearly designed to interact with intelligent beings. The predecessors would not have created an unsolvable puzzle. There must be a solution, but it requires a type of thinking that we have not yet discovered. Dr. Keltash looked around the room at his students. This is why I have brought it here today. Perhaps young minds, working together, can see something that older, more set minds have missed. Then his eyes settled on Jake, and his expression changed to something that might have been amusement. Of course, I do not expect miracles. This puzzle has defeated the greatest intellects in known space. It will require the most advanced mathematical thinking, the most sophisticated pattern analysis, and the deepest understanding of logical systems. Jake got the message. The professor was making it clear that this was not something a human could solve. This was for the real students, the ones with advanced brains and superior intelligence. The rules are simple, Dr. Keltash said. You will work in teams to study the cube and attempt to find the solution. You have the rest of the class period. Use any tools or methods you think might help, but be careful. The cube is ancient and irreplaceable. Jake watched as his classmates immediately began forming teams. The two Vorthan students moved together, their crystal bodies chiming softly as they communicated through light patterns. Zix and the other Cathara students gathered around a tablet computer, already beginning to calculate mathematical relationships. The Morgani student did not need a team. Its distributed brain could think about multiple approaches at the same time. It moved closer to the cube and began extending its sensory tentacles to feel for vibrations and electrical patterns. Jake remained sitting in his corner. No one had asked him to join their team, and he had not expected them to. He was used to working alone in this class. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Keltash called out. Since you do not seem to have a team, perhaps you would like to work by yourself? I am sure the experience will be educational." The way the professor said educational made it clear that he expected Jake to fail completely. This was probably meant to be another demonstration of human limitations. "Sure, Professor," Jake said, standing up. "I'll give it a try." Jake walked over to the cube. Up close, it was even more impressive. The symbols on its surface seemed to dance and shift, forming patterns that were almost familiar but not quite. The colors flowed across the metal like liquid light, and he could feel a slight warmth coming from it. His classmates were already busy with their scientific approaches. The Cathara had connected their tablets to sensors and were scanning the cube from every angle. The Vorthan were projecting complex light equations onto their work surface. The Morgani was using its tentacles to map the cube's electromagnetic field. Jake just stood there and looked at it. He did not have advanced sensors or mathematical computers. He did not have tentacles that could feel magnetic fields or eyes that could see energy patterns. All he had were his regular human senses and his regular human brain. But as he stared at the cube, something strange began to happen. The shifting patterns and changing symbols started to look less random and more like something he had seen before. Jake reached toward the cube, then stopped. He looked around the classroom at his teammates, who were all busy with their high-tech equipment and advanced analysis methods. Maybe he should try to be more scientific about this too. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Keltash said from across the room, "please, do not let us stop you. I am very curious to see the human approach to advanced problem-solving." The professor's tone made it clear that he expected to be entertained. Jake could see some of his classmates looking over at him with expressions that seemed amused. They were probably wondering what the primitive human would do with such an advanced puzzle. Jake decided to ignore them. He had learned that it was better to just focus on the task instead of worrying about what everyone else thought. He reached out and gently touched the surface of the cube. The moment his fingers made contact, the cube responded. The symbols on the surface began moving faster, and the colors shifted more rapidly. New patterns appeared and disappeared, and Jake could feel a slight vibration through his fingertips. "Fascinating," he heard Dr. Keltash say. "The cube's response to human contact appears to be similar to its response to other species. At least your neural activity is sufficient to trigger its basic functions." Jake ignored the professor and focused on what he was feeling and seeing. The cube was warm, not uncomfortably hot, but noticeably warmer than the air around it. The vibration was gentle, almost like a heartbeat, and the patterns on the surface were definitely not random. As he watched, Jake began to notice that certain symbols appeared more often than others. There seemed to be a basic set of maybe 20 or 30 different symbols that repeated in various combinations. Other symbols appeared only occasionally, and some appeared just once before disappearing. Jake picked up the cube and turned it in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, but not too heavy to handle easily. As he rotated it, he noticed that the patterns flowed from one face to another as if they were all part of a larger design that covered the entire surface. "What are you doing?" Zix called out from his workstation. "You should be measuring and recording data, not just playing with it like a toy." "Yeah," Jake said, not looking away from the cube. "I'm just trying to get a feel for it first." The Cathara made a clicking sound that Jake had learned meant disapproval or annoyance. Feeling is not a scientific method. You need to analyze the mathematical relationships between the symbols and calculate the energy patterns. Jake continued turning the cube, watching how the patterns changed. "Maybe," he said, but I want to understand what I'm looking at before I start measuring it. From their workstation, the Vorthan students flashed patterns of light that Jake was pretty sure meant something like typical human illogical behavior. They had connected sophisticated scanning equipment to their analysis station and were projecting three-dimensional models of the cube's internal structure. The Morgani student had extended 8 of its 12 tentacles around the cube, forming a circle about a foot away from where Jake stood. It was mapping electromagnetic fields and vibration patterns without actually touching the artifact. "You are disrupting my sensors," the Morgani said in its deep, echoing voice. "Your bioelectric field is interfering with my readings." "Sorry," Jake said, but he did not move away. Something about the patterns was starting to make sense to him, and he did not want to lose his focus. Dr. Keltosh walked over to observe Jake more closely. "Mr. Martinez, perhaps you could explain your methodology to the class? I am sure they would be interested in how humans approach complex problems." Jake could hear the sarcasm in the professor's voice, but he tried to answer honestly. "Well, I'm trying to see if there's a pattern or a story in the symbols. Like, maybe they're not just random designs. Maybe they mean something." "A story?" Zix clicked loudly. "This is an advanced technological device, not a children's book. The symbols represent mathematical formulas and scientific data." "Maybe," Jake said, still turning the cube slowly in his hands. "But what if they represent something else too? What if the predecessors thought about things differently than we do?" The Kithra student's mandibles clicked rapidly in what Jake recognized as the insect equivalent of laughter. The predecessors were the most advanced civilization in galactic history. They would have used the most logical and efficient methods possible. They would not have wasted time on primitive storytelling. Jake felt his face getting warm, but he tried not to get angry. He had heard comments like this many times in the past 3 months. According to his classmates, humans were too primitive to understand advanced thinking. They were good for simple tasks, but not for real intellectual work. "Look," Jake said, "I know I'm not as smart as you guys. I know humans are new to all this space stuff. But maybe that's not always a bad thing. Maybe sometimes it helps to look at things with fresh eyes. Fresh eyes that lack mathematical training and logical reasoning ability," Dr. Keltash said. "Mr. Martinez, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this puzzle requires advanced analytical thinking. It has defeated some of the greatest minds in the galaxy." "I understand that," Jake said. "I'm not saying I can solve it. I'm just trying to understand what I'm looking at." Jake continued studying the cube, trying to ignore the comments from his classmates. As he watched the flowing patterns, he began to see something that reminded him of stories he had read as a child. The symbols seemed to flow in a sequence, almost like sentences in a book. There were symbols that appeared at the beginning of sequences, like capital letters starting a new paragraph. There were symbols that appeared at the end of sequences, like periods ending a sentence. And there were connecting symbols that seemed to link different parts of the pattern together. "It's like reading," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "What was that?" Dr. Keltash asked. "Oh, nothing," Jake said. "I was just thinking out loud." But Jake was starting to get excited. What if the cube was not just a mathematical puzzle? What if it was some kind of book or story that had been scrambled? What if the predecessors had hidden their message in a narrative instead of in equations? Jake looked around the room at his classmates. They were all focused on their scientific analysis, measuring angles and calculating frequencies and mapping energy fields. They were looking for mathematical solutions to a mathematical problem, But what if it was not a mathematical problem at all? What if it was a story problem? Jake started looking more carefully at the patterns on the cube's surface. If this was a story, then the symbols should follow some kind of sequence. There should be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if the cube was a puzzle, then maybe the story was scrambled and needed to be put back in the right order. As he studied the cube more carefully, Jake began to see sections that seemed like they belonged together. There were groups of symbols that flowed naturally into each other, and there were other groups that seemed disconnected or out of place. Jake started to rotate sections of the cube, trying to line up the patterns that seemed like they belonged together. Each time he moved a section, the entire pattern changed, and new symbols appeared. His classmates were too busy with their own work to pay much attention to what Jake was doing. But Dr. Keltash was watching carefully, and Jake could see curiosity beginning to replace the amusement in the professor's yellow eyes. Jake became completely absorbed in studying the cube. The rest of the classroom seemed to fade away as he focused on the flowing patterns and shifting symbols. He turned the cube slowly, watching how the designs connected and flowed from one surface to another. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that this was some kind of story. The symbols had a rhythm to them, like the rhythm of spoken language. Some symbols appeared frequently, like common words such as "the" or "and" in English. Other symbols appeared only in specific contexts, like specialized vocabulary. Jake noticed that certain sections of the cube seemed to form chapters or scenes. There would be a group of symbols that flowed together naturally, then a transition area, then another group that had a different feel to it. It was like reading a book where different chapters had different moods or settings. This is definitely a narrative, Jake whispered to himself, but it's all mixed up. He started trying to follow the story from beginning to end. There seemed to be opening symbols that introduced characters or settings. Then there were action symbols that showed events happening. And there were conclusion symbols that wrapped up each section. But the sections were not in the right order. It was like someone had taken a book, cut it into pieces, and then glued the pieces back together in random order. The story was all there, but it was completely scrambled. Jake began rotating different sections of the cube, trying to put the story back in order. When he moved one section, it would affect the patterns on adjacent sections, and sometimes symbols would change or new ones would appear. It was like the cube was responding to his attempts to solve it. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Keltash said, approaching Jake's work area. "Could you explain what you are doing? Your method appears to be quite different from standard analytical approaches." Jake looked up, realizing that he had been working in silence for quite a while. His classmates were still busy with their scientific equipment, but the professor was watching him with an expression of curiosity. "Well," Jake said, trying to organize his thoughts, "I think this cube is telling a story. Like, the symbols are not just random designs or mathematical formulas. They're like words and sentences that have been scrambled up." Dr. Keltash's scaled eyebrows rose. "A story? Mr. Martinez, this is an advanced technological artifact. The predecessors were scientists and engineers, not storytellers." "But what if they were both?" Jake asked. "What if they used stories to hide their scientific knowledge? Or what if their way of thinking was so different from ours that they naturally expressed complex ideas through narratives?" The professor looked skeptical. "Even if that were true, how would you determine the correct sequence? There could be millions of possible arrangements." Jake pointed to the cube. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." See, some of these symbol groups seem like they naturally belong together, and there are transition symbols that seem to connect different parts of the story. If I can follow the narrative flow, maybe I can put the pieces back in the right order. From across the room, Zix looked up from his calculations. That is completely unscientific, he clicked. You are just guessing based on subjective interpretations. There is no logical basis for your assumptions. Maybe not, Jake admitted. But logic hasn't solved this puzzle in 200 years. Maybe it's time to try something different. Jake went back to studying the cube. He was starting to see larger patterns now. There seemed to be 3 or 4 major storylines that wove together throughout the narrative. One seemed to be about exploration and discovery. Another was about conflict and resolution. And there was a third that seemed to be about transformation or change. The storylines were interconnected, with symbols and themes from one appearing in the others. It was like a complex novel with multiple plot threads that came together at the end. Jake started trying to follow each storyline separately, rotating sections of the cube to bring related symbols together. As he worked, the cube's responses became more dramatic. The colors shifted more rapidly, and new patterns appeared that he had not seen before. Interesting, the Morgani student said, extending a tentacle toward Jake's work area. The electromagnetic patterns are changing significantly. Your manipulations are triggering responses in the cube's internal mechanisms. Jake barely heard the comment. He was completely focused on the story that was beginning to emerge. As he lined up related symbols, the narrative was starting to make sense. He could see a tale of an ancient civilization that had faced a great challenge. They had searched for solutions across the galaxy, fought against terrible enemies, and ultimately found a way to transform themselves into something new. The story is about the predecessors themselves, Jake said, his excitement growing. It's their history. The symbols are telling the story of what happened to them. Dr. Keltosh moved closer. Even if you are correct about the narrative nature of the symbols, how does that help you solve the puzzle? Because the story has an ending, Jake said, and right now the ending is in the wrong place. See these symbols here? He pointed to a section of the cube. These are conclusion symbols, but they're appearing in the middle of the narrative, and these opening symbols are near the end where they don't belong. Jake continued rotating sections of the cube, following the story from its beginning to its proper conclusion. The more he worked, the more responsive the cube became. Sections that had been stuck began to move more easily. Colors that had been dim began to glow more brightly. The Vorthan students had stopped their own analysis and were watching Jake work. Their light patterns showed confusion and curiosity. They had never seen anyone approach a problem this way. This is fascinating, Bright Pattern flashed. The human appears to be solving the puzzle through pattern recognition rather than mathematical analysis. It cannot possibly work, Quick Flash responded. Complex technological devices do not respond to primitive storytelling approaches. But Jake was getting close to something. He could feel it. The story was almost complete, with just a few sections still out of place. The cube was warming up in his hands, and the patterns were flowing more smoothly. I think I've got it, Jake said, making one final rotation. The symbols on the cube suddenly aligned into a perfect flowing pattern. The story now ran from beginning to end without interruption. It told of the predecessors' journey from a single planet to a galaxy-spanning civilization, their discovery of transcendence, and their transformation into something beyond physical existence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cube began to glow. The cube erupted with light. Not the gentle glow it had been showing before, but a brilliant radiance that filled the entire classroom. Jake had to squint as patterns of pure energy danced across the cube's surface. The symbols were now moving, with purpose, flowing like liquid light from one face to another. "Impossible," Dr. Keltash whispered, his yellow eyes wide with shock. Jake felt the cube growing warmer in his hands, but not uncomfortably hot. It was more like holding something alive, something that was waking up after a long sleep. The vibrations he had felt before were now stronger, creating a gentle humming sound that seemed to come from deep inside the artifact. Around the classroom, all the scientific equipment began reacting to whatever was happening with the cube. The Cathara's sensors started beeping frantically. The Vorthon's energy scanners flashed warning lights. Even the Morgani student pulled its tentacles back in surprise as electromagnetic fields spiked around Jake's position. "What did you do?" Zix demanded, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "What did you do to it?" "I just put the story in the right order," Jake said, staring at the cube in amazement. "I followed the narrative from beginning to end." The cube's surface began to change. The flat panels that had seemed solid were now sliding and shifting, revealing that the entire structure was far more complex than it had appeared. Sections rotated on hidden axes, while others telescoped outward. It was like watching a flower bloom, but made of metal and light instead of petals. "Everybody step back," Dr. Keltash ordered, his voice sharp with concern. "We do not know what kind of energy this device might release." But Jake did not move. He felt completely safe holding the cube. Whatever was happening, it felt right. The artifact was not malfunctioning or about to explode. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. As the cube continued to unfold, a crystalline core became visible at its center. The core was about the size of a tennis ball and seemed to be made of some kind of transparent material that captured and reflected the light from the cube's surface. As Jake watched, the core began to project a three-dimensional hologram into the air above it. The hologram started as a simple point of light, then expanded into a complex star map. Jake could see solar systems, trade routes, and what looked like navigation data for traveling between distant galaxies. But this was not like any star map he had seen before. It showed regions of space that were completely unknown to current galactic civilization. "By the Great Hive," Zix whispered. "Those are hyperspace routes, but they lead to sectors that have never been explored." The hologram continued to expand and change. Now it was showing technical diagrams and blueprints for technologies that were far beyond anything Jake had seen at the Academy. There were designs for engines that could travel faster than light without using hyperspace. There were plans for energy sources that seemed to generate power from empty space itself. Bright Pattern and Quick Flash were flashing light patterns so rapidly that they looked like strobing disco lights. Jake was pretty sure they were saying something like incredible advanced technology beyond current understanding, but he was too focused on the hologram to translate properly. "This is what the greatest minds in the galaxy have been trying to find for centuries," Dr. Keltash said, his voice filled with awe. "The technological secrets of the predecessors." The hologram shifted again, now showing what appeared to be terraforming techniques that could turn dead planets into garden worlds in a matter of years instead of centuries. There were medical technologies that could extend the lifespan of any species indefinitely. There were communication systems that could send messages instantly across any distance. "How?" the Morgani student asked, its voice echoing with confusion. "How did you solve in minutes what our greatest thinkers could not solve in lifetimes?" Jake looked around at his classmates. They were all staring at him with expressions of shock and disbelief. Even Dr. Keltash seemed stunned by what had happened. "I don't know," Jake said honestly. I just saw it differently than you did. You were all looking for mathematical solutions and scientific formulas. But I saw a story that needed to be put in the right order. But how did you know what the right order was? Dr. Keltash asked. How could you determine the correct sequence without any analytical framework? Jake tried to think about how to explain it. It's like, have you ever read a book that had been cut up and mixed around? Even if you didn't know what the story was supposed to be about, you could probably tell which parts belong together. Some sentences just naturally flow into other sentences. Some paragraphs belong in the beginning and others belong at the end. But this is not a book, Zix protested. This is an advanced technological device. Maybe, Jake said. But maybe, for the predecessors, technology and storytelling were the same thing. Maybe they thought about the universe in terms of narratives instead of equations. The hologram was still displaying new information. Jake could see architectural plans for cities that could house millions of beings while using almost no natural resources. There were designs for spacecraft that could travel between dimensions. There were even what looked like instructions for creating new forms of life. This knowledge could advance galactic civilization by thousands of years, Dr. Keltash said, quietly. And you unlocked it by treating a sophisticated technological artifact like a children's storybook. I guess so, Jake said. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the predecessors designed it that way on purpose. Maybe they knew that only someone who could see the story would be able to solve the puzzle. The professor looked at Jake with an expression that was completely different from his usual condescending attitude. There was respect there now, and something that might have been admiration. Mr. Martinez, Dr. Keltash said slowly, I believe I owe you an apology, and I believe I have been wrong about human intelligence. Jake felt the cube beginning to settle down. The hologram was still active, but the bright lights were fading to a more manageable level. The cube's panels were locking into their new configuration, and the humming sound was becoming quieter. It's still working, Jake said, holding up the cube. All the information is still there. I think anyone can access it now that it's been activated. He carefully placed the cube back on its stand in the center of the classroom. The hologram continued to display technological marvels, rotating slowly so that everyone could see the different designs and diagrams. Jake looked around at his classmates. They were still staring at him, but their expressions had changed completely. Instead of amusement and condescension, he saw curiosity and respect. Even Zix had stopped clicking his mandibles dismissively. How did you learn to think that way? The Morgani student asked. What kind of training did you receive on your planet? Jake almost laughed. No special training. I just grew up reading a lot of stories. Dr. Keltash approached the cube with trembling claws. The holographic displays were still active, showing technological blueprints that made the professor's eyes widen with each new image. He reached toward one of the projections, and the display responded to his touch, expanding to show more detailed specifications. This energy matrix, he whispered, studying a complex diagram. It could power an entire star system indefinitely. The theoretical framework alone would require decades of research by our best scientists, but here it is, complete with construction details. The other students gathered around the cube, their earlier scientific instruments forgotten. Zix extended, his forearms toward different parts of the hologram, his mathematical mind racing to understand the equations being displayed. These calculations, Zix clicked in amazement, they use mathematical principles that we have not discovered yet. But the logic is perfect. I can see how they work, even though I could never have derived them myself. Bright pattern and quick flash. were communicating in rapid bursts of light as they studied the energy readings coming from the cube. Their crystalline bodies were literally glowing with excitement as they absorbed information that was far beyond their current understanding. The Morgani student had extended all 12 of its tentacles toward the cube, using every sensor it possessed, to analyze the data streams flowing from the artifact. "The information density is incredible," it said in its echoing voice. "There is enough knowledge here to advance our civilization by millennia." Dr. Keltash turned to look at Jake, his expression a mixture of amazement and confusion. "Mr. Martinez, I must ask again. How did you solve this puzzle? What method did you use that our greatest minds missed for 200 years? Jake sat down in his chair, suddenly feeling very tired. The excitement of solving the puzzle was wearing off, and he was beginning to realize just how significant this moment was. "I honestly don't know how to explain it," he said. "I just looked at it and saw a story instead of a machine." "But how did you know it was a story?" the professor asked. "What made you think that way?" Jake tried to put his thoughts into words. "Well, on Earth, humans have been telling stories for thousands of years. It's one of the things we do best. We see patterns and narratives in everything. When I looked at the symbols on the cube, they reminded me of words and sentences. They had a flow to them, like language." "But surely other species tell stories as well," Dr. Keltash said. "The Kithara have epic poems about their great mathematical discoveries. The Vorthan communicate through light patterns that could be considered narrative art." "That's true," Jake agreed. "But I think humans might be different in how we think about stories. For us, stories are not just entertainment. They're how we understand the world. We use narratives to explain science, history, relationships, everything. Maybe that's because we evolved on a planet where we had to work together in groups to survive." Zix looked up from the holographic display he was studying. "Are you suggesting that human evolution created a different type of intelligence?" "Maybe," Jake said. "Think about it. Eukathara evolved in hives where mathematical precision was essential for coordination. The Vorthan developed in crystal formations where harmonic patterns determine survival. The Morgani evolved as collective intelligences where distributed thinking was the key." Jake stood up and walked over to the cube. "But humans evolved as storytellers. We had to remember and share information across generations without any technology. We had to convince other humans to work with us, to follow us, to trust us. Stories were our technology." Dr. Keltash was nodding slowly. "So when you looked at this puzzle, you instinctively applied narrative thinking instead of analytical thinking." "Right," Jake said. "While you were all looking for mathematical formulas and energy patterns, I was looking for characters, plot, and story structure. I was trying to figure out what the predecessors were trying to tell us." The Morgani student rippled its tentacles thoughtfully. "But why would an advanced technological civilization embed their knowledge in narrative form?" Jake thought about this for a moment. "Maybe because stories last longer than formulas. Think about it. Mathematical knowledge can become obsolete as science advances. Technical specifications become useless when technology changes. But stories can carry wisdom across any amount of time or technological development." "That is a fascinating theory," Dr. Keltash said. "But it implies that the predecessors thought about knowledge in a fundamentally different way than we do." "Maybe they did," Jake suggested. "Maybe they realized that the most important truths are not just facts and formulas, but the patterns and relationships that connect everything together. And maybe they decided that the best way to preserve that understanding was through narrative." Bright pattern flashed a complex pattern of lights. Jake was getting better at reading Vorthon communication, and he thought the message was something like, "This explains why analytical approaches failed." Quick Flash responded with patterns that seemed to mean narrative structure requires different cognitive processes than mathematical analysis. "They're right," Jake said. "When you approach something as a math problem, you look for equations and logical relationships. But when you approach something as a story, you look for meaning and emotional connections. You try to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means." Zix clicked his mandibles slowly. So the predecessors designed this puzzle to be solved by beings who could think narratively rather than analytically. "But why?" Dr. Keltash asked. "Why would they want to exclude analytical thinkers?" Jake studied the holographic displays that were still rotating around the cube. Maybe they weren't trying to exclude anyone. Maybe they were trying to find a species that could think both ways, a species that could combine analytical intelligence with narrative understanding. "You mean, like humans?" the Morgani student asked. "Maybe," Jake said. "Humans are pretty good at both logical thinking and storytelling. We have scientists and engineers who can solve complex technical problems. But we also have writers and artists who can find meaning and patterns in chaos. Maybe the predecessors were looking for a species that could bridge those two types of thinking." Dr. Keltash looked around at the amazing technology still being displayed by the cube. "If that is true, then humanity may have a unique role to play in galactic civilization. Your species might be able to understand and use predecessor technology in ways that other species cannot." Jake felt a shiver of excitement mixed with responsibility. "That's a pretty big possibility to think about." "Indeed it is," the professor agreed. "And it suggests that we have been wrong about human intellectual capabilities. Perhaps different types of intelligence are equally valuable, just in different ways." The cube continued to display its technological marvels, but Jake was no longer looking at the hologram. He was thinking about what this meant for humans in the galaxy. Maybe they were not the primitive, limited species that everyone thought they were. Maybe they were exactly what the galaxy had been waiting for. Word about Jake's achievement spread through the Centauri Academy faster than light-speed communication. By the next morning, students from every species were talking about the human who had solved the Nexus Cube in minutes. Jake found himself surrounded by curious classmates everywhere he went. At breakfast in the Academy's central dining hall, a group of Vorton students approached his table. Their crystal bodies chimed softly as they communicated through light patterns before one of them spoke aloud. "Jake Martinez," the Vorthan said in its musical voice. "We have been studying the recordings of your puzzle solution. We would like to understand how narrative thinking works." Jake looked up from his food, still not quite used to being the center of attention. "It's not really complicated," he said. "You just try to see patterns and connections instead of just analyzing individual pieces." Quick Flash, one of his classmates from the problem-solving class, flashed a pattern of blue and green lights. "We understand pattern recognition," it said. "But we analyze patterns mathematically. How do you analyze them narratively?" Jake thought about how to explain it. "Well, when you read a story, you don't just look at each word by itself. You look at how the words connect to create meaning. You try to understand what the author is trying to tell you, not just what the individual sentences say." The Vorthon students flashed rapid patterns of communication between themselves. Then Quick Flash asked, "Could you help us apply this thinking to a problem we have been working on?" "Sure," Jake said. "What kind of problem?" The Vorthon students projected a holographic display from their personal devices. It showed a complex diplomatic situation involving trade disputes between several alien species. We have been trying to find a mathematical solution that optimizes resource distribution, Quick Flash explained. But every equation we create fails when we test it with real political data. Jake studied the holographic display for a few minutes. Instead of looking at the trade numbers and resource calculations, he tried to see the story behind the conflict. What if this isn't really about trade? He suggested. What if it's about respect and recognition? What do you mean? Quick Flash asked. Look at the pattern of disputes, Jake said, pointing to different parts of the display. The smaller species are not just asking for more resources. They're asking to be included in decision-making. They want their voices to be heard. The real story here is about power and representation, not just economics. The Vorthan students flashed excited patterns of light as they began to see the conflict in a new way. If we address the recognition issues first, Quick Flash said, then the resource distribution might solve itself. Exactly, Jake said. Sometimes the surface problem is not the real problem. You have to look for the deeper story. Similar conversations began happening all over the academy. Cathara students approached Jake for help with understanding poetry and metaphorical language. Morgany students wanted to learn how to recognize emotional patterns in multi-species communications. Even some of the professors began seeking his input on problems they had been struggling with. Dr. Keltash made a formal announcement to the entire academy about Jake's achievement, standing before hundreds of students and faculty in the main auditorium. The professor spoke with a humility that Jake had never heard from him before. For too long, Dr. Keltash said, we have assumed that analytical intelligence is the only valid form of advanced thinking. We have dismissed other types of cognition as primitive or inferior. The events of yesterday have proven us wrong. The professor looked directly at Jake, who was sitting in the front row with his classmates. Mr. Martinez has shown us that narrative intelligence is not a weakness or limitation. It is a different and equally valuable way of understanding the universe. Perhaps it is time for us to learn from humanity instead of just teaching them. The audience erupted in discussion as students and faculty talked excitedly about the implications. Jake felt both proud and overwhelmed by the attention. After the announcement, Jake was approached by Dr. Vera Chen, the Academy's Dean of Xenological Studies. She was a Centaurian, one of the few species that looked almost exactly like humans, except for their silver skin and large black eyes. Mr. Martinez, she said, I would like to offer you a unique opportunity. We are creating a new academic program that combines analytical and narrative approaches to problem solving. Would you be interested in helping us design the curriculum? Jake was stunned. Me? But I'm just a first-year student. I don't know anything about designing academic programs. You know more than you think, Dr. Chen said with a smile. You understand how narrative thinking works in ways that most of our faculty do not. We need someone who can bridge the gap between human and alien approaches to knowledge. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself busier than he had ever been. He was still taking his regular classes, but now he was also working with professors and advanced students on developing new teaching methods that combined different types of intelligence. He helped design exercises where Cathara students learned to recognize emotional subtext in communication, while human students learned advanced mathematical modeling. He worked with Vorthan students on projects that required both harmonic analysis and storytelling techniques. Jake also began receiving communications from universities and research institutions across the galaxy. Everyone wanted to know more about human narrative intelligence and how it could be applied to their unsolved problems. The most surprising development came when Jake received a message from the Galactic Science Council. They were inviting him to present his ideas at their annual conference, alongside the most respected researchers in known space. "I can't speak at a conference like that," Jake told Dr. Keltash when the professor showed him the invitation. "I'm nobody special. I just solved one puzzle. That one puzzle has changed how we think about intelligence itself," Dr. Keltash replied. "Your approach has already led to breakthroughs in fields ranging from archaeology to diplomatic relations. The scientific community needs to hear your perspective." Jake looked around the classroom where he had spent so many uncomfortable hours feeling stupid and out of place. Now, the same room was filled with students from multiple species working together on projects that combined analytical and narrative thinking. "A few months ago, you thought humans were too primitive for advanced education," Jake pointed out. Dr. Keltash's scaled face showed what might have been embarrassment. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I confused different with inferior. I assumed that because humans think differently, they think less effectively. I now realize that diversity of thought is not a weakness, but a strength." Jake accepted the invitation to speak at the conference. He was nervous about addressing such an important audience, but he was also excited about the opportunity to represent humanity and share what he had learned about the value of different types of intelligence. As Jake prepared for his presentation, he reflected on how much had changed since that day with the Nexus Cube. He was no longer the struggling student who felt like he did not belong. He was beginning to understand that humanity's differences were not flaws to be overcome, but gifts to be shared with the galaxy. 6 months after solving the Nexus Cube, Jake stood in front of his new classroom at the Centauri Academy. The room looked very different from the one where he had first encountered the ancient puzzle. Instead of being arranged for different species to work separately, the desks were organized in mixed groups. Humans sat next to Kythera, Vorthan worked alongside Morgani, and students from a dozen other species collaborated on shared projects. "Good morning, everyone," Jake said to his cross-species problem-solving class. "Today we're going to work on something that has been puzzling archaeologists for the past 50 years. He activated the holographic display at the front of the room. The image showed ruins on a distant planet, with strange architectural patterns that seemed to follow no logical design principles. These are the spiral cities of Kepler 7th. Traditional analysis suggests they were built randomly, with no planning or purpose. But I think there might be another explanation." A human student named Lisa Parker raised her hand. She was Jake's younger sister, who had arrived at the Academy 3 months ago as part of Earth's expanded exchange program. "Are you thinking this might be another narrative structure?" "Exactly," Jake nodded. "What if these cities were not designed for efficiency or logic, but to tell a story? What if the layout itself is a form of communication?" Zix, who was now one of Jake's most enthusiastic supporters, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "The mathematical analysis shows no functional patterns, but perhaps we have been looking for the wrong type of pattern." Quick Flash flashed a series of lights that Jake had learned meant willing to try new approach. The Vorthan had become one of the best students at combining analytical and narrative thinking. Dr. Keltash, who now co-taught the class with Jake, approached the holographic display. "Mr. Martinez, would you like to guide the analysis, or shall we let the students discover the approach themselves?" "Let's see what they come up with," Jake said with a smile. Jake watched as his students began working together in ways that would have been impossible 6 months ago. The mixed groups combined their different types of intelligence naturally, with analytical minds providing data and narrative thinkers finding patterns and meaning. Lisa worked with a young Morgani named Thought Swimmer, using human storytelling, instincts, and Morgani distributed consciousness to map emotional flows through the city layouts. Zix partnered with a human student named David Park to combine mathematical precision with intuitive pattern recognition. The Nexus Cube sat on Jake's desk as a reminder of how much things had changed. The technologies revealed by the cube were being developed through unprecedented cooperation between species. Faster-than-light communication networks were being built using designs that combined predecessor blueprints with innovations from multiple civilizations. Jake had received reports that similar collaborative approaches were being adopted throughout the galaxy. Universities on dozens of worlds were restructuring their programs to include multiple types of intelligence. Research projects that had been stalled for decades were suddenly making breakthroughs as teams combined analytical rigor with narrative insight. "Professor Martinez," Lisa called out, using the title that still made Jake feel strange. "I think we found something." Jake walked over to her workstation, where she and Thought Swimmer had created a three-dimensional model of the city ruins. Instead of looking at the buildings as separate structures, they had traced the pathways between them. "The streets and walkways tell a story," Lisa explained. "If you follow the main routes through the city, they create a narrative path. It's like a giant book that you read by walking through it." Thought Swimmer rippled its tentacles in agreement. The emotional resonance patterns support this theory. Different sections of the city evoke different feelings, creating a journey of experiences for the inhabitants. Jake studied their work with growing excitement. "This is brilliant. You found a completely new form of urban planning based on experiential storytelling." Dr. Keltash approached to examine the student's discovery. "Remarkable," he said. "This suggests that the builders were not just creating functional cities, but immersive narratives. The residents would live inside a story." Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he watched his students make connections that would have been impossible without their mixed species collaboration. This was what he had hoped to achieve when he agreed to help develop the new curriculum. Soft chime indicated that someone was requesting entry to the classroom. Jake looked up to see Dr. Chen entering with a guest he did not recognize. The visitor was tall and graceful, with pale blue skin and large silver eyes. Jake thought it might be a Epsilon Eridani, but he was not certain. "Professor Martinez," Dr. Chen said, "I would like you to meet Ambassador Kira Stellanos from the Galactic Federation Council. She has a proposition for you." Jake felt a familiar nervousness as he approached the distinguished visitor. Even after all the recognition he had received, he still sometimes felt like the struggling student who did not belong. "Professor Martinez," Ambassador Stellanos said in a voice like flowing water, "the Federation Council has been following your work with great interest. Your approaches to problem-solving have led to significant advances in multiple fields. We would like to offer you a position as Director of Cross-Species Cognitive Research." Jake was stunned. "That sounds like a very important job. Are you sure you want a human for something like that? I mean, Earth has only been part of the Federation for a few years." "That is exactly why we want you," the ambassador replied. "Your perspective as a newcomer, combined with your unique insights into narrative intelligence, makes you the ideal candidate. The galaxy needs someone who can help different species understand and work with each other more effectively." Cal looked around his classroom at the students who were still working on their project. Human intuition was combining with alien analysis to create new understanding. Different types of intelligence were not just coexisting but enhancing each other. "I'm honored by the offer," Jake said. "But I think I'd like to stay here at the Academy for now. There's still so much work to do in developing these collaborative approaches to education." Ambassador Stellanos smiled. "I hoped you would say that. The Council agrees that education is the foundation of everything else. We are prepared to provide significant funding to expand your program throughout the galaxy." Jake felt a surge of excitement. "You mean we could set up similar programs on other worlds?" "Indeed," the ambassador said. "We want to create a network of institutions that teach collaborative thinking across species barriers, and we want you to lead that effort." As the ambassador and Dr. Chen left to discuss details, Jake returned to his students. They had made even more progress on decoding the spiral cities, discovering layers of meaning that neither human nor alien analysis could have found alone. Jake picked up the Nexus cube from his desk and turned it in his hands. The patterns on its surface still flowed and shifted, but now they looked like old friends rather than incomprehensible mysteries. The cube had changed his life and opened up possibilities he had never imagined. His personal communicator chimed with an incoming message. Jake smiled when he saw it was from his parents back on Earth. His mother had sent a news article about the Centauri Academy's new educational programs being adopted by universities throughout human space. "We're so proud of you," the message said. "Who would have thought that our son, who spent all his time reading stories, would end up teaching the galaxy new ways to think?" Jake laughed as he put the communicator away. His mother was right. All those hours reading books and telling stories had prepared him for something he could never have imagined. The galaxy was discovering that intelligence came in many forms, and that the greatest breakthroughs happened when different types of minds worked together. As his students continued their work, Jake reflected on how much had changed since that day when he had first picked up the Nexus cube. Earth was no longer seen as a primitive planet trying to catch up with advanced civilizations. Instead, humanity was recognized as bringing unique gifts to the galactic community. The future looked bright for cross-species cooperation and understanding, and Jake knew that the best discoveries were still to come.